Sometimes I just like scrolling through monster manuals to find the next thing to terrify players with. Hello adventurers, I am the Welsh GM, the one Welshman whose accent got eaten by an owlbear. The new 5.5e monster manual has got a lot of people talking, especially in comparing how monsters are designed now compared to how they were designed back in 2014, and debating the shift that the game devs have taken in their philosophies. But one of the big things that is missing from the 5.5e monster manual is any sort of guidance to GMs on how to build their own monster. Outside of maybe one page in the DMG which covers the vague concept of twisting an existing monster to suit your better needs, there's no design philosophy or methods to help people come up with brand new monsters to fit the kind of stories they want to tell. And frankly, speaking for myself, that's really disappointing. Making monsters is one of the most enjoyable things for me as a GM, and I think a lot of people enjoy it too. Tailoring that monster to be exactly what I need for the narrative I'm telling that session, such that it has both the right narrative and mechanical impact for the players. So with that in mind, and the fact that D&D aren't going to do it themselves, I might as well fill the void and give you some tips and advice on designing your own monsters and some philosophies to take with you when you start constructing that new bear owl from scratch. Before we get deep into the philosophy of designing a monster, it's worth taking a second and thinking about where we can get inspiration for our monsters from. I talk a lot about using mechanics to help define and tell a story, and there's no real better way to do that than with monsters. Monsters are the primary way, especially in games like D&D and Pathfinder, that your players will mechanically interact with the world and feel like they are being the heroes they want to be. So we want to make sure that the monster is right for the story we're telling. So obviously your own campaign and your own session notes will be a critical piece to the puzzle when coming up with the inspiration for your monster. But there are other places too. I think the best way is to go and check out artists online. There are a bunch of subreddits full of these kind of things. ArtStation exists, DeviantArt, even Pinterest, although some people have issues with it, all of which are great places to collate and find gorgeous looking fantasy, sci-fi, monster art to be inspired by whenever you need it. I have a fairly large Pinterest board of monsters that I regularly go back to when I'm seeking inspiration for a new monster, whether it's dark and terrifying, or light and whimsical, or just adorable and cute that I want to leave as an option for a player to get as a pet. Likewise, go and consume other media. Horror movies, absolutely fantastic for D&D monsters. Fantasy books, great for kind of bedding them into a world. Even just looking at the world around us is great for inspiration. There are so many weird and wonderful animals out in the world that will serve you great when trying to come up with a new monster. I mean, the Kraken stories came from somewhere. All of these are great ways to just be inspired and come up with new attacks, abilities, or overall ways in which monsters fight that you can then use to design a monster for the game system you're running. Once we're inspired and have got the concept of our monster in our head, we need to figure out what type of monster they're going to be. How do we want them to feel in combat? 4th edition had a great system that's since been adopted by 5th edition publications like Flea Mortals and Forge of Foes that helped categorize monsters into the way in which they play in the encounter. You had stuff like the Brute, the Artillerist, the Controller that just helped GMs contextualize how they were meant to use that monster when using them in a combat situation. And this is a great way for us to design monsters as well by trying to fit them into these categories. It's not mandatory, but it can help us shape the concept of the monster so that when we're coming up with mechanics, we have a better idea as to what we want them to do. If we know the monster we're designing is a Brute, we know we're going for large spikes of damage, but is relatively easy to hit, compared to a monster that's a Controller that's going to be focused on debuffing the players or moving them around the battlefield to set up other monsters. It can be really tempting when you're designing a monster to come up with 7 really cool attacks and abilities and try to jam them all into the same monster, and what you end up with is a confused mess that you don't know how to run at the table because you don't know what it's trying to be. If you focus on the type of monster it's going to be, you can reserve the other ideas you come up with for another monster down the line and allow this one to shine at the thing you want it to shine at. So if you're building an ambusher creature, you want to focus on it being mobile and stealthy rather than having high defensive features. Comparatively, a defender, you would make sure it has that high AC and the ability to protect others around it, rather than being able to move around the battlefield quickly. There is a lot more to this topic that more creative and intelligent people than me have said. I strongly recommend you check out Forge of Foes, which there'll be a link down in the description below. It goes into this, breaks down each category and some suggested mechanics for each kind as well. Now, I am a firm believer that when it comes to TTRPGs, mechanics are there to help us set the tone and deliver the narrative we want. Ultimately, mechanics are the tool through which we tell our story. And that doesn't just end because we're in combat, and in games like D&D, if anything, it arguably starts with the monster. So, when it comes to designing your monster, especially in something like D&D, you need to think about its role in the narrative and what effect it's gonna have on the overall arc. What sort of combat are we wanting when we roll initiative in this encounter? What purpose is this monster serving in the narrative? What impact is it going to have on the player characters as they continue their journey? Let's use an example from a recent episode of Unrolled Stories, where the Castigator, the mage-hunting inquisitors of the Empire, finally caught up with the party. They had a reputation of being fearsome, terrifying, and ruthless. When I was designing that stat block, I knew I wanted him to feel like an oppressive force, someone who was capable of locking down the party and stopping them from doing what they wanted to do. Note, I wasn't trying to take away their agency, I just wanted them to feel like what they were trying to do was being blocked by someone more talented, more skillful, and more in the know. It was a matter of giving the stat block little things here or there that acted as hindrances to the way that I knew the party, especially the spellcasters, wanted to fight. So there was psychic damage every time one of them cast a spell after being hit with an attack. There was a reaction that acted as a counterspell and damage if anyone cast a spell while close by him. There was a smoke bomb that changed the battlefield and really forced them out of their comfort zone of party arrangement. All of this combined to show the players the kind of person they were up against, someone who was trained to deal with mages and would not let them succeed. Someone who knew how mages tended to fight and therefore how to deal with them. At that point, it's up to the party to figure out how they're going to deal with it. All of this added up to make them feel like they had lost control, that they were on the back foot and panicking the entire time. They could still act on their turn, they were still capable of doing things, but at every turn, every option felt like the wrong one because it constantly got beaten back or they got punished for even trying. So when it comes to designing your own monsters, think about the way that they're going to interact with the narrative, think about the role that they serve in the overall story, and make sure their mechanics line up with that so that the players feel it themselves on their own character sheets. We want the mechanics of the game to serve the narrative such that everyone feels the tone of what we're trying to achieve. Something else I did with that Castigator is I gave them weapon mastery, which, when my players don't have it, we started before 5.5e came out, felt unfair. And that was kind of the point. Monsters don't have to play by the same rules as the players. This is not to say that you should build a monster that fundamentally just disregards the entire system that you're running, but it is to say that the monsters don't have to follow the exact set of limitations, rules, and abilities that players would have. Because it can be fun to subvert the expectation of the players and set them up with new challenges that they're unprepared for. So what does this look like? A great example of this is the non-Newtonian ooze, which was a creature I put into Bolo's bargain bin, there'll be a link in the description, that inverts how armor class works. So instead of trying to get equal to or above the AC, the players have to get equal to or below the AC of the creature, because its very nature means that the harder you hit it, the harder it becomes, therefore you can't deal damage to it. This just momentarily inverts the expectations of the players, and they've got to come up with ways to be less good at hitting. Do they start using weapons they're unproficient with? Do they find ways to give themselves disadvantage? Does the party's bard cast Bane on everyone so they're all subtracting 1d4 when they need it? The Castigator with weapon mastery showcased to the players that this person was more trained with weaponry than they were. It presented a challenge and a fear factor of something of, oh god, we don't know how to deal with this, while also then opening the door for something that they could learn down the line. Even simple things like allowing an Archmage to cast 2 spells in one turn. They throw out a fireball and then Misty Step away as their bonus action. It's a very small thing, but it showcases that the Archmage is a very powerful spellcaster that doesn't abide by the same rules and limitations as the players. The reason I love doing this is it catches players off guard and forces them to suddenly connect into the encounter and engage that problem-solving side of their brain. Often combats can become boring and repetitive even over an extended campaign where people fall into the same habits and methods that they always do. By having a monster that subverts expectations and does things they're not expecting, they've got to find ways to deal with it. I will say, use this sparingly, not every monster needs to do this, it's just a useful thing to just change up combat every now and again. And if you really want something to confuse and terrify your players, just have the monster do damage of a type they've never heard of. 2d8 corruption damage, 1d4 custard damage, 3d12 allergy damage from a bee sting. Ultimately, the point is don't feel confined by the player's handbook and the rules that the players are abiding by when you're trying to come up with a creative and fun monster. Monsters aren't going to be alive long enough to break the game with this exploit, so have some fun with it and maybe your players will find it memorable and enjoyable. My final and favourite piece of design philosophy when it comes to monster design is making sure it synergizes with itself. I like to say a good monster is like a good horror film. It's not all about the hack and slash and the blood dealt, it's about the rise of tension and the feel of an unstoppable presence coming to defeat you. One of the biggest flaws of the monster manual in 5th edition was that a lot of monsters were just attacks and nothing else, which meant they were boring. In fairness, they have done better in 5.5e with monsters having a little bit more self-interaction, enabling GMs to play them like they would feel in the fiction. A great example of this is barbed devils that now on their attacks do grapple a creature and then they deal damage to that grappled creature on their next turn. Monsters should be able to set themselves up for success by relying on the abilities on their stat block, not needing someone else to help them out. Ideally, with abilities that take a round or two to come to fruition. You don't want to see the setup and payoff happen on the same turn because that's not really a setup. That might as well just be a single action that the monster does. And the players feel cheated because they couldn't prevent the thing from happening. I spoke about this in the bestiary entry on dragons, about how dragons don't have the ability to set up their breath weapon. They're just reliant on the players being foolish enough to group up. By giving a creature with a breath weapon the ability to push other creatures with their melee attacks or even grapple them with a bite, it becomes that much more scary when the players realise, oh no, we've all been pushed to group together. The terror of the monster becomes realised at that point because the monster knows it has a breath weapon and wants to get as many people in there as possible. Some other great examples of synergy, the Calcaneus Harbingers I wrote into Vecna's Book of Vile Darkness have an ability where they cause a frighten effect when they reduce a creature to 0 hit points, and then have a separate ability that a creature that is frightened of them, they crit on a 19 or 20. Subtle synergy like this showcases the nature of the monster. The Harbingers are there to sow fear and terror in the populace, and then they end up snowballing because they reduce a creature to 0 hit points, some people become frightened of them. They kill that creature because of the expanded crit range, so more creatures become frightened of them, and they become this unstoppable force advancing through the population. It's about adding a layer of tactical complexity to a monster that it doesn't rely on anyone else to achieve or the intelligence of the GM to pull off. Just simply by running the monster as written means the monster feels like how it does in the fiction. Speaking of the Calcaneus, another point on this, it doesn't just have to be synergy within self, especially if you have a group or set of monsters like gnolls or goblins. It's fun to have 3 or 4 of these subtypes of monsters that when paired up in a team suddenly become more effective. Maybe there's one creature that grapples opponents and another one who has advantage on attacks against grappled creatures. Suddenly the party has to think about which threat do they need to deal with first, how do they avoid this stacking effect of these great creatures working together. The Calcaneus in Vecna's Book of Vile Darkness all share an ability where they gain armor and additional damage when they're close by each other, showing they're a unified fighting force. Intergroup synergy with monsters is a fun mirror to the player's own party synergy that presents an interesting tactical challenge to deal with. Synergy is ultimately about making the monster or monsters feel like a realised thing that knows its own strength and wants to use them. Plus, they create a natural tactical element to the encounter that players can then interact with. And that's it! Designing monsters for both publication and for my own campaigns is a real joy in mechanical storytelling that I don't think I'll ever get tired of. These are just the initial things that go into my early design process when coming up with a monster. Obviously, there's a lot more when it comes to monster design around challenge rating and balance and the exact ins and outs of mechanics and resistances, But this is a great starting point when you're trying to come up with a monster design and what you need to consider when you're coming up with abilities. But what do you think? Do you like making monsters as much as me? What other design philosophies do you have when creating your monsters? Let me know in the comments below what your favourite monster you've designed and run at your table was. If you want to check out any of the books I mentioned in this video, there will be links in the description below, so do check them out if you can and go and support other amazing creators in the TTRPG space. Reading how other people think about monster design is always interesting to me, so I do recommend checking out those books. But also take your time reading monster manuals from third parties like Tome Foes from Kobold Press, Flea Mortals from MCDM, or the Monster Grimoire from Grim Hollow, because they all have slightly different approaches when it comes to designing a monster too. In the meantime, I do believe that's everything I had to say on monster design. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go see whether that owlbear has coughed up my accent yet. And remember to keep telling stories. Sometimes monsters are too pretty.